So today I'm talking to Tim Harris. Tim Harris is the best-selling author of several Laugh Out Loud series for kids. The more recent ones would be Toffle Towers, but he first burst onto the scene with Exploding Endings, which is short stories, and Mr. Bambuckle's Remarkables, of which I think there are 3 books. Is that correct, Tim?
Four books in that series.
I'm sorry, there's 4. So, Tim, thanks for joining us. How are you, mate?
I'm pretty good today. It's almost like the stomach's just starting to gurgle for some lunch, James. So I'm starting to imagine chicken sandwiches.
Well, we're all in lockdown at the moment, and I guess I know that you're a mad cricket nut like me. I could just edit that out to say you're a mad nut, but you're a mad cricket nut. Pity it's not cricket season, isn't it?
Well, is it any season at the moment?
It's not any.
It's the season. Yeah.
Well, as a proud Manly supporter, you'd be pretty sad at the moment, right?
Now, for those listening, there's a twinkle in James's eye across the Zoom session there. I'm actually wearing a Parramatta Eels shirt, which I think I actually chose it for 2 reasons. First of all, this is WestWords, and so I know that there might be a few Para fans. And secondly,
nice
my team finished above James's team.
Finished after 2 rounds. Yeah, we're winless. Yeah. Did you win both your games?
Minor premiers.
Minor premiers, there you go. That's the only way they're ever going to get there. So moving on. Today we're talking about plot. Now, look, I'm going to come out here and say this. I'm terrible at plot. I mean, I've written lots of books, and you could argue that the plots in those books are okay. But that's the bit that I really struggle with, because I'm not a planning kind of writer. I'm a writer who takes an idea and then runs with it and waits to see what transpires. So I'm actually really, really interested to hear what you have to say, Tim, because I know you're a planning writer and you're all about the plot. Well, you're not all about the plot. You're a good character writer and a good descriptive writer as well. But I'm really keen to hear how you do this, because I'd love to be able to do this better myself. So where do you start? How do you get that plot thing off the line?
So I like to start with a concept before plot is mapped out, and a concept can be a really big idea. It can be a really small idea as well. And I might use an actual example of a concept before I tell you about how then I mapped it out with a plot. So here's the concept, and this is based on a true story, something that happened to me in real life. I was walking back from the shops one day, and I think I had some bread or some milk in my hand. It was a really simple little errand, and I was about halfway returned to home, looking straight ahead down the footpath, and a little voice called out to me. And it was a real human voice, and the voice said, "Excuse me, do you want to buy this for $5? And I turned to my left to the house that I just walked past, and there was a kid, probably about 10 years old, sitting on a chair, and he was holding up a piece of art that he had drawn, which was actually an iPhone screenshot. So he had drawn a screenshot of all the icons on an iPhone, and he's selling it for $5. In the end, I said no, and I went home. But actually, I felt guilty, and I walked back and bought it because it had planted a concept. It was the concept of, this kid wants to make money, and it was a money-making concept. I wonder if I can turn this into a story. So how did the plot come about? Well, there was the concept planted. Someone wants to make money. Then the job was to give this story a beginning, give it a middle, and give it an end. And so that's when the planning started to happen. All
right. So you took the concept, you turned it into a plot. Have you got any other examples from your own work that you can give us? So, for example, let me try and work this out. If you're talking about Toffle Towers, you're talking about, so the concept is a kid with the peculiar name of Chegwin for some reason, inherits or is made the manager of a ramshackle hotel. That's the concept?
Yeah, that's right. And that's a really great question, James, because we now swing to the other extreme. So the first example was the most simple concept I could think of in my book so far, and that was about a 3,000-word short story about the boy who wanted to make a whole lot of money selling screenshots. But when we moved to Toffle Towers, which is a whole story, it's I think about 28,000 words, so a lot longer than the 3,000 words. This concept had a bit more depth to it, and the concept was 10-year-old boy inherits hotel, and 10-year-old boy is a daydreamer, and 10-year-old daydreaming boy has to save this hotel from ruin. So the
Right.
concept was a lot richer, and so therefore the planning took on a whole different approach in terms of what do I need to map out for this.
So obviously, if you're going to work this way, planning is important. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I struggle with the planning side of things. It's not until I've got a few ideas bouncing around that I start to work that out. But you like to do that stuff right near the beginning.
I do, yeah. I'll try and dig out, and I'm not sure if we can link to it, but I'll try and dig out a little 15-second video. It's a time-lapse video of the mapping out of one of my Mr. Bambuckle books, and it was all very predetermined what was going to happen when. So it was extremely planned plotting.
What's your? I mean, I think that you're right. It's important. How do you play with the idea of foreshadowing when you're doing plotting?
I got in trouble from my editor from this for actually having too much of it. And one of the things that I really loved about Paul Jennings' short stories is he would often foreshadow at the end of a chapter to keep the reader reading. Like, I want to find out what happens in the next chapter.
So we'd better clarify for anyone who's at this point going, I don't know what they're talking about, which won't be many people, but there might be a couple. What's foreshadowing?
Yeah, so foreshadowing is when the writer deliberately gives a little clue to the reader about something that might be coming up. It might be very subtle. It might just hint that. I'll give you an example. Perhaps at the end of a chapter, a character is looking out the window and the postman arrives and is carrying a letter, and then the chapter ends where we know that maybe the character needs to go and get that letter. But it also could be pretty major. For example, and I'll quote one of my own stories. I just did a reading in fact, it's the $5 story. I just did some readings on Facebook, and one of the chapters it ends with this line. It says, I hadn't made much money selling screenshots that day, but little did I know how much money I was about to make the next day. And so then the reader thinks, oh, well, something big's about to happen. I need to keep reading. So foreshadowing tells the reader that something is going to happen, but it doesn't exactly specify.
The other really good example of foreshadowing that I like to use is the third Toy Story movie, as the toys are sliding down the trash compactor and they're about to get incinerated and crushed. And you think, I can't see a way out for them. And then the thing that saves them is the little aliens and the Claw who we met in the first movie, which was made 10 years earlier. So if at the time when we saw those little alien guys, we were like, oh, they're cute. But we didn't ever for a moment think that we're going to rely on them 10 years later to actually save the whole show.
Yeah, that's a really good example, and it's a very subtle example because the foreshadowing is just a little clue 10 years earlier, as you said, which ends up coming back to help the story. And I wonder, James, do you reckon that was deliberate foreshadowing, or do you think that was just a handy coincidence?
I don't know. What I always say to people when I'm talking about foreshadowing is that this is an opportunity, a really simple opportunity you have to make yourself look like a genius. But what it requires is a second draft often, or if you're planning the way you do, maybe not. But yeah, you can go make your reader go, oh my gosh, I had no idea that's what that was about. Oh, that's brilliant. But you don't have to be a genius to do it. It's just a matter of going back and finding that little thing that's going to
yeah, and that's right. And if it doesn't end up being foreshadowing, it could, depending on the genre of writing, it could end up being a red herring as well.
A red herring. So what's a red herring?
So a red herring it's a little tool that a writer might use to plant a false seed with the reader. For example, especially murder mysteries might love to use red herrings, and the reader might think, oh, Mr. Jones here was looking very suspicious, so he must have been the one who committed the crime. But perhaps Mr. Jones was frowning for something else. So a red herring is going to give the reader some options. Who could it have been? Was it Mr. Jones? Was it someone else?
And of course, with a good murder mystery, for example, like an Agatha Christie or something like that, if you have 7 major characters, then you have 6 red herrings in the real one, don't you? Because the fun of reading a story like that is that you're trying to work out who it is with the limited clues you've been given. But they've all got to be legitimate clues, don't they? You can't you can't sort of throw out something that isn't real, right?
Yeah, that's right. They should be. Otherwise, the risk is the story becomes confusing and there are too many extra things going on. And when it comes to plot, the writer's goal is to really steer the reader along that main plot. And yeah, too many red herrings can certainly cause confusion, or too much foreshadowing as well can then be too predictive. So we have to be careful to find the balance.
Nice. So characters, plot, complication, setting, emotional engagement, structure, these are all elements of writing that are equally important, I suppose. But they tie together in a way. So how do your characters and your plot tie together? I know you've got something to say about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoyed listening to the interview you did with Deb Abella. And I actually have a fairly similar process to Deb in that the main character should want something. And so for Toffle Towers, Chegwin wants to save the hotel so the workers keep their jobs. And so that helps the plot because Chegwin wants something. He actually pushes the story forward. If he didn't want to save the hotel, then we don't have a story. It's as simple as that.
But does that mean he can just walk in and say, I want to save the hotel, and the bank goes, oh, okay, that's fine then?
Wouldn't be much of a story, would it?
It wouldn't, right. So I guess what I'm saying is they've got to want something, but you've got to make them work a bit for it, don't you?
Yeah, that's right. So they should be working for it. And there's a really funny example. I remember laughing quite hard the first time I heard this joke because someone said to me, Lord of the Rings, massive thick book. There's 3 movies, goes for 9 hours. And a friend said to me, do you reckon Lord of the Rings would go for 9 hours if Frodo didn't want the ring? I thought, actually, no. Yeah, no. So the character wanting something, yeah. The character should be working hard, you're right. And because the character should be wanting something. And really, a story is zeroing in on a particular character in a particular stage of their life. And if they don't want something, then there's not much of an interesting plot for the reader.
And I guess it's relative to who the character is. I mean, the kid in year 4 isn't going to be interested in what the stock market's doing. He's much more interested in the fact that he forgot to bring his lunch money to work, or he forgot to do his homework or whatever, whereas the guy in the stock exchange doesn't really care too much about his sandwiches. You just go and pick up something else, right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's where young writers can have a lot of fun because you might be familiar with particular, your own worlds. Your world might be your cricket team. Your world might be your after-school band or dance group or whatever it is. And you can use that to help tell a story because if you're familiar with the world, then it's much easier to identify with a character and place that character and give them something to want. And then suddenly you've got a plot to work with.
So a term that people throw around a lot when they're talking about plot is subplot. Can you put that in terms that people can really understand? What's a subplot and how do we do that?
Yeah, so we might start with, so the main plot is the main story. And as the word says, main being the major, it's really the essence of the whole story or the whole narrative. But then when we get to a subplot, suddenly we might skip off to the side or skip off underneath with just a little second storyline. So in Toffle Towers, I've said that the main plot is for Chegwin to revive the hotel. The whole series revolves around that main plot. But a little subplot is that somebody keeps stealing food from the kitchen. And now the whole story, otherwise I would have called the story Kitchen Towers if it was about the kitchen, but no, it's Toffle Towers, about the hotel. So now we have 2 storylines. We have a main storyline. Chegwin is trying to save the hotel. But now there's something else to think about. Somebody has been stealing food from the kitchen. And so subplots create a richer narrative. And I think as readers, sometimes we actually love subplots almost as much as the main plot because they can create a lot of intrigue. And I remember reading Harry Potter for the first time and just being swept up in all the different layers of subplots that were put in there. Generally, the bigger or thicker a book, generally the more subplots we'll begin to have.
So something like the movie Titanic. What's the main plot there? The main plot there is a ship sinking, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
So what's the subplot in that story?
So the subplot there would be we have a romance. Probably that would be the major subplot. We have a romance between 2 people who are on that on that boat while it's sinking.
Now, Tim, some stories take place over a really long time, and others take place over a short time. How do you manage the flow of time when you're playing with a plot? I mean, you don't want certain. I guess the example I'd think of is that song "Friday" by Rebecca Black, that breathtakingly terrible song that her mum paid for, that is now one of the biggest most hit clips on YouTube. But she spends a long time telling us what she has for breakfast and how she gets to the bus stop. What are your thoughts on how the time frame in a story works in relation to plot?
Well, I think as a result of you saying that, Friday is probably going to peak on YouTube again. It's going to rise up the charts.
Well, it'd be nice if they linked back to us, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's true. Actually, yeah, WestWords might get a bit of a peak on YouTube. Yeah, so that really great question, and this is important for young writers to get their heads around, because you can actually cause yourself harm, especially in an exam situation. So the reality is, for most young writers, you'll be clocked at 40 minutes of writing time until you leave school, and that's for test situations. So if you're given 40 minutes to write an entire story, and you want to write an epic story about some hobbits who are trying to take a ring to Mount Doom, a story that takes months and months and has subplots, there's no way you can tell that story in that time. So time frame can actually dictate the quality of your writing when you're going through school. And if you deliberately tell a story that, say, takes place over lunchtime, so now that's a very short time frame, what you are giving yourself is the chance to be descriptive, the chance to help a character become real, and a chance to perhaps put some dialogue in the story as well. So time frame, guys, is just so important. Don't write epic stories unless you're doing them for the love of it in your free time, which is a wonderful thing to do. Try and train yourself to focus in on characters and look at the smaller picture, and that by reducing your time frame there, you're allowing yourself to expand as a writer.
One of the things I like to talk about with short stories is this idea that sometimes you've got a long story that you tell over the course of your 3,000 words or whatever, but sometimes it's just a slice of life where you kind of dip into that person's life and it's just a moment. And I think it's an acting term. They say that you should get in late and get out early on a scene, and I guess that's pretty good advice as well.
That's really good advice. And I like that idea of a slice. And for most of the people listening who are going to, you're writing stories that are 2 or 3 or 4 pages long. That's it. And the word count there is not even going to be 1,000 words. And so you are looking to write a bit of a slice of a story. And time frame is how you control that. You can't write 3 pages of a 10-year story. It just doesn't work that way. And if you do, there's going to be a lot of paragraphs that start with the next day, the following February, and suddenly we have a watery story.
Watery, I like that. Watery. One more question before we wrap up. You've got a plot. You've laid it all out. You've got it all. You're comfortable with where all the turning points are and the Act 1, Act 3, all that stuff. Does that mean you have to stick to it? What happens if you get to a point and you go, actually, I've got a much better way for this to go? How do you handle that? Do you have to go back to the drawing board and completely reconfigure your plan? How do you handle that? Because we all do this. We all get to the point and go, actually, that's a better idea, because ideas develop as we play in the sandpit. So how do you do that?
Yeah, super question. And for the writers listening, for the young writers listening, I always like to say to students I'm teaching, run with your improved idea. And that analogy of the sandpit's a good one, because you might start by making a one-story castle in the sand, but suddenly you realise, hey, actually this would be really cool if there was a window here. Or if it's your story, you might go, actually, you know what? I'm going to introduce this character here because now it adds a whole new element to the story I hadn't planned. So if that happens, you may have to revise what happens after that in your plan. or you may not. It just really comes down to the actual scene that you're writing. But be patient with it and constantly revise your plan, because that's the only way you can stay on top of it. And so the trick to that one is, and I think this is what I try and do, is plan simply. So I plan the main beats of my story, and I actually leave a little bit of room in there for things to change or things to develop. But the key, and this is what I'll really stress here, the key is you must know, well, I think you must know how the story is going to end when you're learning to write. Someone like, I know you, James, you've written over 30 books. You'd be an excellent pantser, because you can back your ability to get to a really great end.
So when you say pantser, what are we talking about there?
Yeah, sorry. So pantser is you writing with a bit of a concept or a bit of an idea, but you haven't mapped it out explicitly. So that's obviously a very different approach to plotting, where you do map it out explicitly.
So you're flying by the seat of your pants is where that term comes from.
Yeah, exactly. Or even you could say improvising a story. But I think for young writers, knowing the end of a story lets you get there. And if the risk with pantsing or not planning is that you may never reach the end of your story. And I think for high school students, we probably need to know where the story is going to end.
Do you ever have you ever done this thing where you've gone partway in and you've gone, oh, I want to explore this other idea, and as you're doing that, you introduce a new character, and then you go, actually, this is a far more interesting story than the one I started with, and this character's story is more interesting. I might have to discard that. Have you ever had to do that?
No, I haven't. I think mainly because of the way that I do plan. But what I have done is introduced ideas that then I'll pull in later. So let me give you an example. Let's say chapter 1, suddenly there's a new character who I hadn't planned that I think, oh, brilliant, this is a really great character. What I'll do is then find some room in chapter 4 or chapter 7 to bring that character back in, because they were really adding to the story. Yeah. Have you done it?
Yeah, I have actually. Yeah, I've had to discard an entire character and gone, and that becomes a structural question. Then you go, well, the questions that you ask when you're playing with structure of who's telling the story, when are they telling the story, how are they telling the story, and is their story actually the most interesting part of the subplot within this story as well?
Yeah, that's right. For the high school writers, it comes down to the purpose of your piece of work. Is it a passion project? If it is, you can afford to really make as many changes as you want. The other extreme is an exam situation where you're given 5 minutes to plan and then 40 minutes to execute. That's where those 5 minutes you really need to get the beats of your story and try and have a strong idea of where you're going to end, because you just won't have time to make huge changes. Yeah.
So I'm going to put you on the spot, Tim, if that's okay. Can I do that?
Yeah, sure.
I want you to imagine that you've got a 40-minute writing exam. And the stimulus you've been given is this. It's a line from a song by Bob Dylan, and the line is, they're selling postcards of the hanging. Use this to describe an event taking place in an alternate universe.
Okay. So the first thing I'll do is read that quote and just get a bit of a feel for it, and it takes 5 to 10 seconds. So I'll say it again for our listeners. They're selling postcards of the hanging. Now, our stimulus says that's a different universe. So straight away, I wanted to go back into probably the 1800s, maybe like Wild West, bush ranger situation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So I suppose, that could be an alternative universe, going back in time. But I think a lot of people are going to be doing it. So what I try and do as a writer is immediately think of the possible perspectives of this story and where it could be. And I'll tell you what I mean. Most young writers are going to be focusing on the hanging, because it's a horrible way to die. And it's really dramatic, and it's naturally going to draw people in. But what I would like to do to get a fresh idea, because at the end of the day, if you're doing an exam, you want your writing to stand out. So I would look at the word postcards, and I would think, well, is there a story about the person who's actually selling the postcards, as opposed to the hanging itself? So perhaps my story could be about the person who's selling postcards has run out of postcards, and suddenly we have this whole new take on the quote instead. Or it could be about someone who buys one of the postcards but is not interested at all in the hanging. And so by being drawn into the easy way is to write about the hanging, but by looking for different perspectives, suddenly you might have a really fresh idea or something that's going to stand out. And then when it comes to the alternate universe part, I think that's probably the hardest part of the stimulus, and your job would be to help the reader with the setting. In fact, you might need to listen to our setting podcast to get some ideas for this one.
Maybe.
But just to summarise that, because I know I sort of spoke for a little while, but the trick is try and find a unique perspective with the stimulus before you start plotting. And so for this one, I was thinking about the postcards, or I was thinking about the people buying the postcards instead of just the hanging.
I guess the other thing is a bit of a sidebar on that, and a good advice for our listeners is, in an exam setting, just because they put up a picture of a lighthouse doesn't mean you have to write about a lighthouse.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think that lighthouse one is a really great example of how you can use a stimulus as a metaphor as well. The lighthouse could represent somebody who's acting as a beacon of hope for somebody else. And I would always encourage young writers to look for those chances to think beneath just the image.
I guess the other example I often give people is if you see a picture of a gate, if they give you a picture of the gate as a stimulus, that's not necessarily a story about a gate. It's more about people being locked out, or people being locked in, or approaches into a different world or whatever. Before we go, Tim, your website so that people can find you in the online world.
My website is www.timharrisbooks.com, and my Facebook and Instagram pages are @TimHarrisBooks.
Beautiful. Okay, thanks, man. We'll talk later.
Thanks, James.
See ya.